Okay, so we've talked about some principles of energy and about energy in how it operates the world in many respects and how it relates to biology and natural selection. And we're going to continue on that course, except we're going to focus on the evolution of our own species. And how did we get here, and what is the relation of that to energy, and how were early human economies energy based? So that's what this is going to be about. Now, again, we start with this hypothesis of Charles Darwin. I am a very strong natural selectionist. We understand that there are other hypotheses, and you are perfectly welcome to hold that perspective. It will not make much difference in understanding that lecture, but just say I'm a very strong Darwinian. Okay, now I'm going to save you from having to take 5 years of graduate instruction in biology and tell you the main things that I learned, especially in my invertebrate biology courses, about how natural selection has prepared us over a couple of billion years for where we are now. So we start with the concept of mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy factories of life. And they take, if you see here, food, and Paul, can you see my arrow moving? Yeah, Ted can anyway. Thank you, Ted.
So can I.
Okay, so you take food and you take oxygen and you feed it to a cell. And that enables your cell to do all the things that cells do. That means that you can move, you can do, the most important thing you do is maintenance metabolism, which means to keep all the molecules in the right place, in the right structures, as determined by the DNA that you carry and that you got from your parent. And this is what essentially all of life does. They take food and they take oxygen and they turn the food from a reduced compound. Reduced means containing hydrogen, occasionally some other elements, but containing hydrogen and having an energy potential, and taking electrons in that food. And just like electrons running around in a wire in an electrical circuit, they carry energy with them. And this energy is used until it ends up as water or carbon dioxide from the process. In other words, you take a hydrogen-rich compound and turn it into an oxygen-rich or oxygen-containing compound. And in that process, going through all kinds of steps of life called glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport, and so forth, you make something called ATP. That's little batteries, the little batteries that carry energy to where it's actually used in the mitochondria. Okay, so where do these mitochondria come from? It is thought that they were originally, way back in time, free living organisms, some kind of what are called euglenoids, euglena type organisms that early life that basically was anaerobic, was able to capture these and use them to enable the early organisms to oxygenate their food and generate and increase by something like a factor of 32 the energy they could get from their food, because you could use oxygen as what's called a terminal electron acceptor. Now, learning how to do all that through 5 years of graduate study is a big order. But fundamentally, what life learned to do is to take oxygen, which was originally a toxic material, and take it from a toxic material that destroyed cells and encapsulate it in these little mitochondria and use it to oxidize our food and make ATP, which is an energy storage. It's called adenosine triphosphate, if you want to know what that is. And a really interesting thing, if you think about life over the long view, is that life is very dependent upon phosphorus, which is relatively rare in the environment today. Well, until humans came along, phosphorus was not common. And so most plants are phosphorus limited. If you buy fertilizer to fertilize your garden plants, it'll be NPK, and the P will be the phosphorus. It'll be very important for your plants. And so at one time, phosphorus was much more abundant. In fact, in the anaerobic environment, the phosphorus was much more abundant than it is now, because it's tied up now with iron. It's, in fact, I taught this to Paul 50 years ago at the bottom of a lake, that if it's anaerobic, then the phosphorus becomes released. Well, okay, so the first thing of really important energy importance to life was the ability to turn oxygen from a toxic material to a terminal electron acceptor that enabled early life to use its food to turn much more of it into energy. The second main thing that happened in this long evolutionary process leading to us is cephalization. So you have, well, here's a Dugesia, and it's got its sense organs. You can see little eye spots up front. And so that has, compared to the euglena, it has a front, a head. And the process of putting your sensory organs and your food access organs in the front of the organism was a very large evolutionary step. But a planarian, this little flatworm here, cute little guys, is inefficient in this way. To feed, it takes a tube out of the middle of its body and goes and sucks up the food, brings it into its gut, and digests it, and then poops it out. It's a process of inefficient in that it's an intake and then an output. And this can be compared with an annelid worm in many respects more advanced, that it has a tube within the tube. That is, like us, it has a mouth and an anus and it's a gut in between. And so this is a one-way process, which is much more efficient in terms of using energy over time, so that different parts of the gut, certainly is the case with us, are specialized to process the food in different ways. So that's a second and third really important evolutionary change. And Maybe the fourth is jaws. So if we take a lamprey, that it has no jaws, it has a mouth, and you can see it has gills, gill slits, but it doesn't have jaws. And you compare that with a trout, and these are, we can't say that the trout is more evolutionary advanced than the lamprey because they're both here today. But the jaws evolved later in life, and that gave that encephalization made it very easy for later life to be efficient at gathering their food. And so we have again this whole transformation of life into this whole process of cartilaginous fish and bony fish and reptiles, amphibians, and all up this pattern of life that leading to where we are. And that's what we're going to think about today, especially is the people. Okay, now let's go back again to this point where a giant meteor, big enough so it didn't burn up in the atmosphere and probably several miles apart across, slammed into the Yucatan. And before that, dinosaurs had been around for a long time and were quite evident. They were doing just fine. And then the age of dinosaurs, except for the birds, ended in one day. Boom! So this, you can find remnants of this debris down in Yucatan. I may have misspoken last time. It's not southern Yucatan, it's northern Yucatan. You can find this crater. I've been there. I have to admit it was pretty hard to tell where the crater had been, but if you do the right kind of aerial photography and imaging, you can certainly find it. And what happened then was it left a layer that you can find all around the earth if you know how to look for it. So this is Cretaceous down below, and this is Tertiary, a whole new geological epoch appears to have happened in one day. And you find a layer of iridium, which is rare on Earth, but abundant in certain types of meteorites, all around the Earth at this geological layer. Now, when this meteor slammed into the Earth, and incidentally, fairly large meteors slam into the Earth now. A couple came into Russia in the last century and wiped out, came down as a big fiery streak and wiped out entire giant forest areas in Siberia. And almost for sure, this is the origin of the Chinese dragons, because some of these in the last 1,000 years have slammed into China. And of course, the Chinese people living, they saw these things, and wham, their forests would burn and all kinds of stuff would happen. So they called them dragons, or whatever the Chinese word for dragons is. I guess that's what happened. But anyway, there was a giant storm of explosive, what we call ejecta, stuff thrown out from this explosion. You can find it all kinds of places if you know where to look. And a lot of it went up in the vicinity of North Dakota, which is what we're going to look at now. And so kaboom! And that was the day the dinosaurs died. And you can find their skeleton buried with ejecta that's related to that impact, and if you know how to look for it, and people certainly spend a lot of time doing that. So we're going to go up to this place, Red Wing structure in North Dakota, and where it's called the Tanis site. Might be the farmer who owns the land, I'm not sure. But this guy named Robert De Palma just did incredible analysis here. And he had to kind of, as always, with people who come up with something new, there are a lot of people who tried to tear down what he was doing. Well, that's the process of science. And so far, he seems to be doing pretty well. And he's found a place in North Dakota. That's where this debris splashed all the way up here, probably a gigantic tidal wave of salt water, came from here, pushed all this stuff up, and came to rest up here in North Dakota. Now, probably it came to rest all kinds of other places that we haven't found yet. But this is just an incredible story. And so he figured out where to look, had some luck in finding a good spot. And it's a lot easier to find fossils in desert areas or dry areas because it's not covered by forests. And he found these big piles of fish. Now you can see the jaws of a fish here. I think that's an eye. There's a fin. Here's some other fins over here. Just hundreds and hundreds of fish piled up in a relatively small area. Look how beautifully preserved some of these fins are. And the interesting thing is some of them are freshwater and some of them are saltwater, and they're all piled in together, including with some debris of trees and all kinds of other stuff. It's just an amazing bunch of stuff. And apparently there was a gigantic tidal wave of salt water and stuff probably piled over Louisiana, Paul, just as a big tidal wave, and came to rest, went up the early Mississippi Valley and came to rest up here in North Dakota, taking with it all kinds of stuff and at the same time killing the freshwater organisms that were there. And in the gills of the organisms, you can find little glass beads that are the remnants of the meteor impact. It's an astonishing story. It was written up in the New Yorker a couple of years ago in a very accessible way. I was fascinated by it. So looks like this something really big happened then. Now, most of these fish, sturgeons and so forth, you can see a sturgeon type tail here. Most of the fish and aquatic organisms seem to have survived somewhere, but not a single dinosaur except the birds survived. Lots of snakes were killed, lizards. Another turtle survived, some turtles, and some early mammals. And they factually found up there in North Dakota a fossil of an early mammal living in underground. And it's thought that this burrow protected these early mammals from the immediate impact of this explosion. They had a bomb shelter, so to speak. We used to make bomb shelters back in the 1950s. Well, these guys had their bomb shelters, and here we have our progenitors, our ancestors. And it was a catastrophe for the dinosaurs, but it was a terrific opportunity for mammals because there was all kinds of food available without competition from those pesky dinosaurs, which they had previously dealt with. Now, there was a time when early mammals and dinosaurs coexisted many millions of years, but the mammals were not becoming dominant. But after this, then I don't know if they exactly, I'd say they became dominant form of animal life. And of course, these mammals went through organisms that are similar to lemurs and similar to apes, to our critters that we assign to our species, to Homo sapiens, the person that we are now. Homo meaning simply man, and sapiens meaning wise, which I'm not quite sure is the right word, but that's what's going on. Okay, so now just to look at human skeletons relative to our closest living relatives, which are the great apes, you can see that we have all pretty much the same bone structure. And incidentally, I'd like to point out, for example, that the radius and ulna, the bones that we have in our extremities are the same. Whales have them, birds have them, certain fish have them. This one bone and then two bones and then five bones pattern is found in lizards and bone and birds and mammals and essentially all vertebrates, give or take a few. And so evolution generally works with the same basic material and adapts them accordingly to what they're doing. Now, for example, a gibbon is very arboreal. That means he lives up in the trees. And you can see that he has very long arms for swinging from branch to branch. And he has an opposable thumb. Now, when I used to teach this to freshmen, I'd have somebody hold on to my wrist, one of the students hold on to my wrist, and I could easily pull it away if they had all five fingers on the top of my wrist. My thumb is there too. Let's see, can you see my thumb? Where's my thumb? There it is. It's on the top. It's just small. There we are. But if I put my thumb down, I can hold on a lot better. So probably some of you are musicians. Ashland is full of musical people. And so you can play a flute or a violin, all these amazing things we can do with our fingers. But we don't have fingers so we can play a flute. We have fingers so we can hang on, or our ancestors could hang on to trees, branches when they're swinging from one to another. I think you can see in a pretty straightforward fashion how being able to hold on to a tree limb with an opposable thumb would have a pretty strong selective advantage. And you can see that especially in the most arboreal of our cousins, the gibbons, and you can see, we can see over here an orangutan, also very arboreal, that the orangutan can hang on pretty well with those long opposable thumbs. And then the chimp is much better at going through the trees than we are, and the gorilla not so well. And we have these long arms, but not as long proportionally as the gibbon, and other features that have occurred as we have gone in out of the trees, as it were. Our ancestors almost certainly lived in trees. And when East Africa dried up, it appears that they came down and began to walk, and our posture became much more vertical. We got much larger bums or gluteus maximus to hold our posture up. And in other ways, we have kept some of the features of our ancestral people, ancestors, but we've changed a lot too. Now, the gibbon is not our ancestor. The chimp is not our ancestors. They diverged from our ancestors some millions of years ago. But here we are. It's a basic plan, and we have our own special adaptations to that. Now, all of the early humans, very early humans, are found in East Africa. And there's just no question that our ancestors came from Africa. Later, these are much, much later up in Europe around the Mediterranean. There are other areas where they found relatively early human remains, but most of them came from this area of Kenya that we know about. Lucy is a very famous fossil that came from East Africa. Now, maybe there's lots of fossils in the Central African Republic or Nigeria, but we can't look there because it's covered with forest most of the time. Now, when I was a young, impressionable freshman, I had an extra slot open when my second semester, and I fortunately signed up for a course in anthropology taught by Dr. Ramshaw, who was a marvelous teacher. And I can still remember very clearly coming into class one morning, and he had a bunch of skulls lined up like this. And, you know, I was young and impressionable that they were the real skulls instead of plaster casts. But Dr. Ramshaw had gotten all these plaster casts and lined them up, and he talked about the evolution of the human skull, and I just found that fascinating. And so basically, what's happened from Australopithecus to Homo erectus to Homo neanderthalis, which is an offshoot to ourselves, as you can see, the cranial capacity, that's this, became larger and larger and larger. The face became flatter. This is called prognathism when it sticks out. The zygomatic arch, which you can feel right here, it's where your muscles that work your jaw come down from, becomes less pronounced. And the ridges over your eyes becomes less and less. All of these, apparently natural selection doesn't hang on to things it doesn't need. And when our jaws receded because we had less of a need for bite, or there was less selection for bite, I know that I had to have teeth pulled out from my jaw when I was 12 or 13 or something. and needed braces because the jaws are receding faster than the teeth. We have too many teeth for our jaws. So evolution is juggling these things over time. For exactly what reason, we can only guess at. Now, here are some other looks at our teeth receding, our face become flatter, our cranium becoming larger. And in fact, our cranium, as our head became larger and larger, it became an increasingly difficult process for a baby to pass through the birth canal. And one of the things I learned back in my anthropology class is that the bones of the head in an infant being born will slip. So whatever selection there was for larger cranial capacity was done even at the expense of causing the head to be squished in the birth canal. And that, of course, led to difficulties in birth with many women, while our heads were being selected for being very large. All kinds of amazing things happened. And here we are. And here's another way, another rendition. Compared to a chimpanzee today, you see, which has stayed in an arboreal life, eating mostly vegetable matter, and nevertheless having canine teeth, which pretty much have disappeared in the human situation. Boy, I remember studying for my anthropology exam, and we were looking at this big, rough football player, and myself and my friend Ray were studying for an anthropology exam and looked at the beetling brows and the zygomagnetic arch and the prognosticism seemed to characterize his roommate, who was a football player. Oh, never mind, that's not a very nice thing to say, but some of these characteristics to various degrees, of course, remain for all of us. Now, this is a reconstruction of what some of these ancestors probably looked like. They're not just skulls, they were people or proto-people. There were at one time simultaneously 8 independent human-like species in Africa, they think. And so there were all kinds of possibilities for what we might end up looking like or being. Even the Neanderthal, they thought the Neanderthal was a separate species from our species, Homo sapiens. But now they find that there's a lot of Neanderthal genes in Europeans, that people of European extract, like me, are probably 3 or 4% Neanderthal. So, of course, there was a mixture of genes all the time through all of these people, and it's really quite amazing. Our original coloring was almost certainly dark, protect us from the sun. And I was a lifeguard a lot as a kid, and I go to my skin doctor, and he'd, freeze out these pre-cancerous things all over my head. I still have to do it every year. And I said to him, how come I have such crummy skin? How come I have this white skin that makes me so susceptible to cancer? And I said, do your Black patients have the problems like I have? And he said, almost never. And he says, I don't know why, but they have, the dark skin protects them from getting cancer. So why in the world would you have light colored skin? Well, it turns out that your skin makes something absolutely essential for you, vitamin D. It's called sunshine vitamin D. And if you don't have vitamin D, you get what's called rickets, your bones break. And when my ancestors, and I guess most of the folks here, went out of Africa, went out of a warm environment into a cooler environment, we couldn't make enough vitamin D. And natural selection apparently took the melanin out of our skins so that we were able to then make enough vitamin D so our bones wouldn't break. And even kids today who are spending less time outdoors, there's a resurgence of rickets amongst the American population of young children because they spend so much time inside. Well, anyway, so all of these evolutionary pressures operated to make here we are down in the bottom, Homo sapiens sapiens, who we are now, and this fella might have black skin and I might have white skin, but we are absolutely genetically the same critter. Obviously, a few genes different, but so here's what we might have been at one time, designed for arboreal existence. But the climate dried, we came out of the trees onto a savanna environment, and we left footprints. These are early human footprints. I don't remember exactly how many, 400, 500,000 years ago, along with some other critters, have been uncovered in Africa. And here's one rendition. They also found at the same place footprints of giraffes and elephants. And here are some of our ancestors of that time going along and leaving footprints. And you look at these two footprints over here on the left, kind of together. Anthropologists have looked at this much more carefully and thought that this might have been two of our early ancestors, perhaps on a date, or father and daughter, or whatever. There's various arguments about how you should interpret these footsteps. But there we are, leaving our footprint on the world. Now, humans evolved in special ways, and I'm going to have a bit of a fun time here showing you intelligence, obviously. So here's a couple of our purported ancestors not understanding the situation where they think they've got this baby elephant without understanding he's hiding behind mother. So intelligence, figuring things out, was critically important to the evolution of humans. And so was cooperation. So obviously one of us alone could not kill this large cave bear, but a group of us might have been able to do that. And look at the spear points. That's going to be really important. Language became very important. So this guy can't pronounce pterodactyl in time to save his friend. But anyway, look out, back. It's a thing. I never can pronounce those things. I love this Gary Larson jokes. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. Mathematics became quite important. Like he's saying that this was a way of which is the Stonehenge was probably not invented to count sheep, but it's saying here's a better way to tally sheep than building these giant devices. Okay, let's look at these early people now from the perspective of energy. And I don't want to say energy is the only critical resource. Obviously, there are others including food, soil, breathable air, cooperation, to mention language. Okay, so you can remember that we were hunter-gatherers for 1,000 times longer than we've been farmers. So whatever our genes are much more a result of natural selection for being a hunter-gatherer, and whatever that took, than for being a farmer, which we are now until last 50 years or so. So let's take a look at the contemporary hunter-gatherers, and I just love this stuff. The Kung, and that exclamation point means that they put the thick tongue in their Kung. I don't know exactly how they say it, but these are people who live just north of the country of South Africa. If you might have seen the movie "The Gods Must Be Crazy," they're beautiful, charming people in my eyes, and in this movie and elsewhere. It's a very funny movie. And this is showing you the Kung project. A guy named Richard Lee did these analyses initially, and they influenced me a lot as a graduate student. So that although meat is a prized food item, plant foods provide the most sustenance. So you can see they have bows and arrows, and the woman would carry, obviously, children. They'd also spend a lot of time gathering their principal food source, which is mongongo nuts. So this is an area, I tried to find exactly where this was on a map yesterday and came close, but I found the Aha Hills still existing. I couldn't find any of these towns, but the Kung need to have water, and they have a series of water holes. And they go from water hole to water hole to water hole, staying at each one for a matter of weeks or a month or so. And they go on a regular cycle to the different water holes where they would go and gather the principal food, mongongo nuts, which are sort of walnuts, from the immediate vicinity of the camp. So they'd move to a new camp, and times were easy. The women and children would go out and gather mongongo nuts. The men would go hunting every once or twice a week. And then after a while, they gather all the mongongo nuts that had lain on the ground, and they'd have to take an overnight trip to go and get more mongongo nuts from further away. And so the energy cost, it wasn't put in terms of energy by Richard Lee, the original author. The energy cost would take a jump when they had to travel more than 10 miles because they'd have to stay overnight and they'd have to eat much of their profit. And they don't go off 3 nights. They don't go further than 18 miles so from their camp, because they would eat all their nuts before they got back to their camp. So they move on to another water hole and start all over again with the nuts that were close by. Now, I've thought a lot about this. I think this was part of how I got the idea of energy return on investment for my fish. So I got to thank these early anthropologists for figuring out a lot of these ideas, thinking about humans in terms of their energy costs. But I had my last undergraduate student was interested in this process in the Kung, and he thought this was wrong. He thought the first sentence here was wrong. that they got most of their energy from women and children gathering mongongo nuts. Hunting gave some needed and appreciated protein, but he went out and gathered this data, which we eventually published together. And we found that and I forgot to say that Richard Lee estimated that the Hung would get 10 calories back for every calorie invested in gathering mongongo nuts, which is a pretty good energy return on investment. But Matt Glaub and I, as an undergraduate, he did this, figured out pretty carefully and had it reviewed and all, the energy return on investment from the hunters, and based on various assumptions, we found out that depending on the size of the animal, the dressing weight, how much of the animal they ate, and they would invest about 27 megajoules in a hunt, and they might return this much as meat to their camp. We found a pretty substantial energy return on investment. So that's my small contribution to anthropology. That probably the hunters had a pretty good energy return on investment, although the early folks thought that was not the case. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about humans. If you look at the size of an organism, and we're roughly the same size as chimps, which are red, and chimpanzees can be bigger than us or the same size, same weight. And this is the cost of moving. And what you find out is that humans have a much more efficient way of moving on the ground, not through the trees now. On the ground, humans have a much more efficient way. In other words, bipedalism, which we do, compared to chimps. I'm sorry, this is bipedal chimpanzee or chimps walking like chimps like to walk, which is with their all fours. But humans are much more efficient. So it appears that our bipedalism was an energy adaptation, being able to walk in our new environment, savannas, in our new lifestyle, which is hunting, much better than chimpanzees. Now, in order for a human to catch an animal like this, now an animal like this, a kudu, is much faster than a human. But humans had to figure out how to hunt them, and a lot of our paper is figuring this out from the literature. A human cannot catch a kudu. What they do is they go out in groups of 3 or 4, which would include a couple of older guys who normally would be really good at tracking, and a couple of young, fast guys. And the 4 of them would walk around till they started out a kudu. And they wouldn't leave till 10 in the morning. And they'd startle the kudu. The kudu would run away very fast, but they'd track that individual kudu. And half an hour later, they'd find that kudu sitting under a bush trying to cool off, because when he ran, he'd heat up. So they do that over a period of 4 to 6 hours. It's called persistent hunting. And they would keep after the kudu until the kudu was so hot from running that it couldn't move. If an animal overheats, it's incapable of motion. And then the young fellas would rush in and spear the kudu. And that's presumably how our ancestors learned how to catch these very fast animals. And so I learned all kinds of very interesting things about this. Another thing is that male baldness, which I happen not to have particularly, may be a means of getting rid of heat, because humans can't outrun an antelope except in the middle of the day, when they can keep tracking him and keep after a particular antelope until they're able to get it to go into heat overload. And so baldness might be a means of getting rid of heat. Okay, humans then moved out of Africa 100,000 years ago, moved into South Asia, into Europe, moved across Bering Straits into the Americas, and spread all through the Americas. Very successful species. And they left their artifacts everywhere. And Neanderthals, remember, there were different groups of humans at that time. And here's a reconstruction in Croatia of a Neanderthal family found near there. And look at them. It looks like a very human situation. We had significant environmental impact. There's something called the megafaunal extinction, where we apparently killed off the mastodons and the mammoths. Humans were very efficient hunters, and the only place where large animals of many types remain with humans is in Africa. And it is thought that the animals evolved avoidance mechanisms as humans slowly evolved more and more potent weapons. But once we were able to hunt an animal with cooperation and with spear points like this, then we doomed a lot of the animals. And so here we go. There go the Wilsons. Seems like everyone's evolving except us. It's cultural evolution. Spear points are an energy concentrating device, as is a knife or a force concentrating device. So you can't, if you try to put your fist through the hide of a beast like this, you can't do it. But if you concentrate the same energy to a spear point, you can. And fire allowed humans to break down the cell walls of plants and eat a lot more plant food, which gave us a much larger energy base compared to most other species. We evolved probably herding. Here's where various turkeys are called turkeys because people thought they came from Turkey, but they came from Mexico. And here's where lots of our important animals, sheep, horse, goats, came from the Middle East, and chickens from India, and so forth. Buffalo from India, but they were spread all around the world. But much of the culture is important about accessing more energy. Thought there was a slide here I'm missing, but at this point, I talk about Jared Diamond wrote a very interesting book called Guns, Germs, and Steel about how it was a lot easier to bring animals east and west in similar climatic conditions. It's much easier than north and south. And that's arguable, but it sure makes a great story, probably some degree correct. And that's a book is a great read about thinking about our ancestors. Okay, the next big thing was agriculture. We think of it as coming from current day Iraq and Tigris and Euphrates Valley. And this I was taught was the origin of agriculture about 10,000 years ago or so. It's so-called Fertile Crescent. But in fact, agriculture seemed to evolve more or less simultaneously at different parts of the world. And certainly people, we found out that the waste food they threw out for their camps, some of the seeds grew, and there it was. And this is genetic engineering. This is what early Native Americans did to turn this plant, which is the origin of corn, into the plant we see today. So the people save the best seeds, those that generated the most profits, the most energy, and we reap the benefits of that today. Now, as soon as you have agriculture, though, you run into a problem because you see the tree has much deeper roots and can pull nutrients from a much deeper depth. But with corn, you have erosion and you have loss of nutrients that the roots can't get. And together, they make a terrific amount of erosion. You can see this in ancient maps of the city of Ephesus was a seaport on the Aegean Sea 700 years ago or 900 years ago. And then 500 years ago, it was already all this area had silted in because the forests were gone. And then today it's like this. So erosion became important and it affected things in many ways. And nutrients were lost. People dealt with this nutrient loss where they did it successfully, which was most places they did not. They shifting cultivation where you cut an area of forest, let it dry and burn it in very sophisticated patterns, and then you plant your cultivars. You plant your maize and other plants in the fertility that is generated from burning the biomass that was there originally. Then you let the forest grow back for 10, 20, or 30 years, and then you cut it again and burn it again and get the nutrients again. Somewhere around 10% of the people in the world make their living from agriculture similar to shifting cultivation, mostly in the tropics. But even in South Carolina, I found as recently as 1950, and in Finland. I took these pictures in the Bolivian Amazon, and it's how people made their living. Another way was with paddy rice, in which you flood an area and then you very carefully let the water out through a ditch over here, and you put in special plants that are great nutrient catchers, and you catch the nutrients as it comes out with the water. You put your own feces called night soil into the land to maintain the nutrients. You grow soybeans that fix nitrogen. You maintain the nutrients very, very carefully. Now, people didn't know what nitrogen was. They didn't know what phosphorus was, but they knew what they had to do. They learned from experience how to maintain the nutrients, which incidentally, we do not do in this country today, hardly at all. And many areas in the tropics are very intensively managed in this way. These are some areas where early civilization, quote unquote, took place based on agriculture, different parts around the world, all happening simultaneously. This is, we didn't even know it was there until 50 years ago, the ancient city of Ur, from which we get the word urban. And if you go inside these old buildings, it's called a ziggurat, go inside and you find gigantic tree timbers that came from trees that are now nowhere near here. This is what used to be a forested area. And humans have had impacts on these areas for long, long times. You can go into southern Mexico in northern Guatemala, and you can find these old ruins, nobody living there, that have been uncovered. They're covered with forest, but these are uncovered. And you look at all these hills, and it turns out all the hills are old cities. There are enormous cities here. 800,000 years ago. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people living here, all covered with forest now. And all this was agriculturally based by Native Americans. I think one of these somewhere is me, but anyway, climbing up these big, big structures. And we might talk about these things when we talk about religion sometime. But the soil was thin. That the soil, you can barely see it at the road cuts. And boom, in just a very short period, these enormous cities collapsed. And there's a wonderful book by Joe Tainter, Collapse of Complex Societies. I need to put together on my site reading list. And well, then we evolved modern farming. There's some marvelous paintings that are in France in the old Gard. I can't remember what it is, but it used to be the Jus de Pommes, the basic museum that has impressionist agriculture, has these marvelous pictures of these oxen really straining plow the field. But look at the power that this increased relative to one human by having these large, magnificent animals pull a plow. And this generated agricultural surplus and some famous paintings, so that these are gleaners. This is called the gleaners, that even after the harvest, there's enough left over to support people. Metallurgy came along, and in various places around the earth, and we can find ancient hearths of how they made metal, and it spread northward into Europe. This was 7,000 BC and 5,000 BC and 2,500 BC. You can see metallurgy spreading. So cities, organization, food surpluses, and metals allowed specializations, including war, military, religions, and the density of humans. The number of people per hectare increased enormously. That's in this column here, from lower Paleolithic, lower Stone Age up until today. And populations went up and down. We think of it as a general upward trend, but they went up and down. And this is where I'm going to stop today and take a 5-minute break and then look for questions. Okay, well, you want to start? Let's see if I sure hope you got a few questions. You gotta, if you want to say something, you gotta unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just noticing that when you're talking about these ancient Mexican ruins, you're saying hundreds of thousands of years, but they weren't really people there at that time.
Okay, I'm not. No, I don't know how long were the Olmecs or the.
I mean, most people think
10 to 12,000 years.
Yeah.
Oh, when did Native Americans get there?
Well, I mean,
10 to 12,000 years ago.
yeah, maybe a little longer, but it was.
Well, first thing is, I've got some pretty good Native American friends, and I want to respect their perspective that they've always been there.
Yeah.
But the contemporary whatever we'll call it, Western perspective is, um, it's been pushed back.
Yeah.
You know, there are arguments that there were a few Native Americans here a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
And so, but the civilizations, you know, I don't have a good chronology of when the Mayans or whomever started there. I think there's a place that's called Pull Trousers Swamp where they've tried to unravel this to some large extent. I, I don't know. I'm not qualified to say much on that.
Well, I think we generally they didn't really have much effect on the land until the Holocene, and
Well, I think that they really were flourishing at 800 AD or whatever we call it now. And that must have taken thousands of years to get up to that level. I mean, you look at reconstructions of that area of how many cities there were there. It was a really highly developed, huge city area. And
it's possible that one of those cities was the largest in the world at that time.
Yes.
Oh,
when the Spaniards came to Mexico City, they'd never seen cities this size in Europe.
Yeah.
So, in a real tragedy is, in the name of Christianity, they burned all the existing books that these people had. So it's really hard to reconstruct. I mean, like their calendars I talked about last time were very intricate.
Yes. But that, you know, if it was only between 10 and 20,000 years, that shows that a lot of cultural evolution could occur in that time.
Oh yeah. Well, and I want to call on Ann, or Paul, you should be calling on Ann and shut me up, but I want to say one thing. Mexico has the most magnificent anthropological museums you can imagine, both in Mexico City and one in Jalapa. And you look at their reconstructions, and it was very, very sophisticated environments at that time. Ann?
Well, I was going to talk about something else, but I just wanted to.
Talk about anything you want.
I'll pile on to that discussion about the ancient civilizations in the so-called New World. But anyway, yeah, I think one of the things that people don't appreciate is as some of the Europeans came into this area maybe earlier than we appreciate, there was that disease aspect that was brought in, or the animals that they brought in, like, for example, swine, and how you get a misimpression historically, like, you know, people are like, oh wow, the East Coast was so hardly any people there when Europeans arrived, but you know, they had arrived earlier on the continent and decimated populations with what they brought in. So it looked like it was not well occupied or civilized, but it had already been purged, you know, by previous people. Anyway, but that's not what I was going to comment on.
Let me comment on that. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm from coastal Massachusetts, and you know, Plymouth was just 30 miles south and all that. And early pilgrims gave accounts of going into Indian settlements, Native American settlements, and finding no people there. All the people were dead.
Yeah.
So, and of course, in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamonds, the middle one is germs. And so humans probably got most of the diseases from chickens and pigs that they lived with, the animals in the lower level providing heat to the upper level. But the disease is spreading very quickly, as in fact they still do. But Europeans and Asians having, long periods of coming into some kind of equilibrium with these diseases, and the Native Americans being completely vulnerable. So
Yeah.
that was a huge impact. Yes. Okay, your second question.
Well, it's really a comment. I've taught a course called Science of Skin where I take a micro time frame compared with your story. And anyway, so like when it comes to comparing chimpanzees and humans in terms of skin, the chimps, we have as many hairs as chimps, but they are obviously thinner. And the main difference from a skin perspective and what we've been able to accomplish is sweat glands. And that was to your point of being able to hunt. The ability to sweat made it possible to not just the less dense hair, but also the sweat glands. So yeah, pretty cool.
I had a colleague at my university who was totally interested in scent as communication amongst organisms. And a lot of mammals have a pretty powerful smell, even compared to humans that I haven't been showering. But he believed that the hair that we have in our armpits was a means of collecting sweat and sending out signals, which in our contemporary society we think are not particularly useful, but might have been very useful for dominance and proprietary and whatever else in the past. I mean, we can really dig in here. I was fascinated to find out that only humans and gibbons have permanent breasts. And being very interested in that question at the time, and I suppose still. And I think that much of this is social. Keeping the guys around, instead of slam bam, thank you, ma'am, to help raise the children became, I suppose, increasingly important, and conceivably this was one means of keeping the guys around or interested and so forth. I don't
Also an
know.
energy adaptation because, breastfeeding went on for quite a while, not just, the first 6 months or whatever we do
Yeah.
now.
But
Yeah.
that just is amazing. I mean, I can't believe what women had to do and have to do for their children. I'm studying now. I'm writing evolutionary papers with my friend Jim Brown, who's a really good ecologist, evolutionary ecologist and mammologist. And we're looking at investment in childcare versus investment in number of offspring. And the give you an example, you can take a tuna fish and a bluefin tuna will have 10 million babies, eggs, and just spew them out in the sea. And the same size white shark might have 100 babies. Sharks carry their children inside them like a human female, and put out little sharklets, which then have a much higher portion of survival. And so we're looking at all across the animal kingdom at the trade-offs. In other words, you gain so much energy in your lifetime, so much surplus energy. What do you do with it? And we're trying to ask this across the animal kingdom. And the tuna, you cannot say that the tuna is any more or less successful than the shark. They're two very different strategies, evolutionary strategies. Well, strategies implies thinking your way through it. No, they happen. They're selection, just plain natural selection. And you can look at all kinds of different creatures. An extreme is a bat. Bats will have 10 offspring, a successful female in her life, but she will nurse them up until they are the size of an adult. So what have been the pressures, the evolutionary pressures to turn a rat kind of creature into a bat? Well, bats are canine, so they're related to dogs, sort of. And what is it that makes the bat have so few offspring, but requiring intensive care, but works for bats? At least it did till people came around. So, good. Come on, raise some hands here. Let's see some hands, please. This is your class.
So I guess I'll say something.
Oh, nobody else is.
So I guess your point in this lecture is really to show how energetics over time have been part of the evolutionary process.
I would say it more strongly than that.
Yeah.
Every organism has invests energy to get energy out of its environment, and of necessity, by natural selection, of investing it into survival and reproduction. All right. And we've thought about that more and more carefully, and we've written about that several papers if you're interested. And so, but there are different strategies. And what's important is that they work. And all you can say is about every creature on the planet now, just pre-human huge impact, were successful. But they're all different strategies, and I think like a tree a lot. A tree is sitting there, and it doesn't have a nervous system, but in a certain sense, its chemicals are competing, and some chemicals are saying, hey, I don't have enough water, so invest energy in digging the root deeper to find some water. And other signals are coming in, I don't have enough phosphorus, so invest energy in getting phosphorus out of the soil through active transport. Somebody else is saying, I'm being shaded, invest more energy in growing high. Some other leaf is saying, I'm being eaten by a caterpillar, invest energy in secondary compounds. And the DNA of that organism is optimizing those different requirements for energy for all those different things. Okay, Keith, I think you had your hand up first. Don't forget to turn off your mic.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I'm a runner, and I've read some books about running, and some of those talk about this theory of human evolution for hunting, like you were touching on there also. And I don't know this for certain, but I think in there it said that humans are the only primates that have an Achilles tendon, and that was part of the adaptation to allow them to run and chase animals for long distances like you were talking about. Is that consistent with what your research and reading and everything has been?
I'm not in a position to answer that, but it's, I mean, are humans the only primates with an Achilles tendon? I mean, chimps can walk. Anybody here, a medical person? I don't know how to answer that question, but I'm gonna look it up and try to send you an answer.
Okay. And I mean, it has special meaning for me too, because about 5 years ago, I blew out my Achilles tendon and it was a long, painful recovery. And that's when I started reading a lot more about Achilles tendons and read some things about their evolutionary development and the hunters running and chasing down animals like what you were talking about. It was very interesting. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that.
Can I send you the paper? Well, I'll put it on my website, the paper I did with Matt that reviews a lot of the running and hunting literature. You might find that interesting.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, so look for it on my on the Dropbox site I have. Okay, all right. Ray.
Yeah, you made a comment about, we've evolved, we spent most of our past history as a hunter-gatherer and shorter amount of time as a farmer. And, but yet our brains and bodies are still organized along the hunter-gatherer. It seems like modern humans, say in the last 500 years or 200 years, do we consider ourselves being sort of separated from the normal evolutionary way of changing with all the technology that we have? In some ways, it's, I don't think our brains have evolved the same way our technology has to adapt to the changes in our environment.
Well, I'm going to talk about that explicitly at some later point in the course. But yeah, I think the main thing is our emotions. I personally am very upset by our racial prejudices and prejudices in general that we have. But I think there is an evolutionary explanation that for thousands of years, you had to be in a situation where if you met somebody new, you had to decide within seconds whether to throw your spear at the person or to make a peaceful greeting. And probably the outstanding cause of death of back in the day were murder by other tribes. And the murder rate in England they are able to calculate was, I think, 5 times more in 1300 than it is now. Do you trust somebody who looks more like you than somebody who looks more different from you? And is that a basis for why so many people have such deep prejudices, which is hard for me to understand, having grown up with very tolerant, shall we say, parents. I don't know, but we may be, you look at what goes on politically, and we in this country, and we're divided into camps so easily, and often by misinformation. And I'm not signaling out any particular direction. I'm just saying that it does seem that there is something very strong in us to circle the wagons with those closest to you. And Although I don't know, you look at people in Bosnia and Serbia, I mean, they're as close as can be, or Irish Catholics and Protestant Catholics were at each other's throats. So that doesn't support that theory very well, I guess, but
Well, that's an interesting point you make. We've been looking at the physical attributes of evolution, but then there's the emotional side that we often don't consider.
as biologists, we say that natural selection works on morphology, which is form, shape, physiology, which is how our body chemistry works, and behavior. And that's what we do. And behavior is passed on genetically. So, okay, we can, I don't see any more hands up. Anybody? And I think it worked to keep using the same original connection. Worked for me and it worked for everybody. So we'll keep using this, but keep your eye on your email just in case something goes wrong. And we'll continue to meet at this time, going into future weeks and pretty soon. Can anybody like Ann tell me how to edit my video? Or Paul, you can? Or you're leaving?
Oh, you'll need to fill me in on my duties, but I've got to get to something
Yeah.
else just now.
Well, you go do something else. And
Charles,
do you,
yeah, if you turn off the recording, a few of us
Yeah.
could maybe stay on.
all right, good. I'm going to turn off the recording.